Hello and welcome to Listen to This Story. Today we are listening to an audio recording of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. I hope you enjoy the video. If you do, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you think it would benefit. Thanks for listening.
Chapter 1 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. Chapter 1 Abbotsford, Part 1. I sit down to perform my promise of giving you an account of a visit made many years since to Abbotsford. I hope, however, that you do not expect much from me, for the travelling notes taken at the time are so scanty and vague, and my memory so extremely fallacious, that I fear I shall disappoint you with the meagreness and crudeness of my details. Late in the evening of August 29th, 1817, I arrived at the ancient little border town of Selkirk, where I put up for the night. I had come down from Edinburgh, partly to visit Melrose Abbey and its vicinity, but chiefly to get sight of the mighty minstrel of the North. I had a letter of introduction to him from Thomas Campbell, the poet, and had reason to think, from the interest he had taken in some of my earlier scribblings, that a visit from me would not be deemed an intrusion. On the following morning, after an early breakfast, I set off in a post-chaise for the Abbey. On the way thither I stopped at the gate of Abbotsford, and sent the postilion to the house with the letter of introduction and my card, on which I had written that I was on my way to the ruins of Melrose Abbey, and wished to know whether it would be agreeable to Mr. Scott, he had not yet been made a baronet, to receive a visit from me in the course of the morning. While the postilion was on his errand, I had time to survey the mansion. It stood some short distance below the road, on the side of a hill sweeping down to the Tweed, and was as yet but a snug gentleman's cottage, with something rural and picturesque in its appearance. The whole front was overrun with evergreens, and immediately above the portal was a great pair of elk horns, branching out from beneath the foliage, and giving the cottage the look of a hunting lodge. The huge baronial pile, to which this modest mansion in a manner gave birth, was just emerging into existence. Part of the walls, surrounded by scaffolding, already had risen to the height of the cottage, and the courtyard in front was encumbered by masses of hewn stone. The noise of the chase had disturbed the quiet of the establishment. Out sallied the warder of the castle, a black greyhound, and, leaping on one of the blocks of stone, began a furious barking. His alarm brought out the whole garrison of dogs. Both mongrel, puppy, whelp, and hound, and curs of low degree, all open-mouthed and vociferous. I should correct my quotation. Not a cur was to be seen on the premises. Scott was too true a sportsman, and had too high a veneration for pure blood, to tolerate a mongrel. In a little while the lord of the castle himself made his appearance. I knew him at once by the descriptions I had read and heard, and the likenesses that had been published of him. He was tall, and of a large and powerful frame. His dress was simple and almost rustic. An old green shooting coat, with a dog whistle at the buttonhole, brown linen pantaloons, stout shoes that tied at the ankles, and a white hat that had evidently seen service. He came limping up the gravel walk, aiding himself by a stout walking staff, but moving rapidly and with vigor. By his side jogged along a large iron-gray staghound of a most grave demeanor, who took no part in the clamor of the canine rabble, but seemed to consider himself bound, for the dignity of the house, to give me a courteous reception. Before Scott had reached the gate, he called out in a hearty tone, welcoming me to Abbotsford, and asking news of Campbell. Arrived at the door of the chaise, he grasped me warmly by the hand. "Come, drive down to the house," said he. "You're just in time for breakfast, and afterward you shall see all the wonders of the Abbey." I would have excused myself on the plea of having already made my breakfast. "Hout, man," cried he, "a ride in the morning in the keen air of the Scotch hills is warrant enough for a second breakfast." I was accordingly whirled to the portal of the cottage, and in a few moments found myself seated at the breakfast table. There was no one present but the family, which consisted of Mrs. Scott, her eldest daughter Sophia, then a fine girl about 17, Miss Anne Scott, 2 or 3 years younger, Walter, a well-grown stripling, and Charles, a lively boy, 11 or 12 years of age. I soon felt myself quite at home, and my heart in a glow with the cordial welcome I experienced. I had thought to make a mere morning visit, but found I was not to be let off so lightly. "You must not think our neighborhood is to be read in a morning, like a newspaper," said Scott. "It takes several days of study for an observant traveller that has a relish for old-world trumpery. After breakfast you shall make your visit to Melrose Abbey. I shall not be able to accompany you, as I have some household affairs to attend to, but I will put you in charge of my son Charles, who is very learned in all things touching the old ruin, and the neighborhood it stands in, and he and my friend Johnny Bower will tell you the whole truth about it, with a good deal more that you are not called upon to believe, unless you be a true and nothing doubting antiquary. When you come back, I'll take you out on a ramble about the neighborhood. Tomorrow we will take a look at the Yarrow, and the next day we will drive over to Dryborough Abbey, which is a fine old ruin well worth your seeing." In a word, before Scott had got through his plan, I found myself committed for a visit of several days, and it seemed as if a little realm of romance was suddenly opened before me. After breakfast I accordingly set off for the Abbey with my little friend Charles, whom I found a most sprightly and entertaining companion. He had an ample stock of anecdote about the neighborhood, which he had learned from his father, and many quaint remarks and sly jokes, evidently derived from the same source, all which were uttered with a Scottish accent and a mixture of Scottish phraseology that gave them additional flavor. On our way to the Abbey, he gave me some anecdotes of Johnny Bower, to whom his father had alluded. He was sexton of the parish, and custodian of the ruin, employed to keep it in order and show it to strangers. A worthy little man, not without ambition in his humble sphere. The death of his predecessor had been mentioned in the newspapers, so that his name had appeared in print throughout the land. When Johnny succeeded to the guardianship of the ruin, he stipulated that, on his death, his name should receive like honorable blazon, with this addition, that it should be from the pen of Scott. The latter gravely pledged himself to pay this tribute to his memory, and Johnny now lived in the proud anticipation of a poetic immortality. I found Johnny Bower a decent-looking little old man, in blue coat and red waistcoat. He received us with much greeting, and seemed delighted to see my young companion, who was full of merriment and waggery, drawing out his peculiarities for my amusement. The old man was of one of the most authentic and particular of cicerones. He pointed out everything in the Abbey that had been described by Scott in his Lay of the Last Minstrel, and would repeat, with broad Scottish accent, the passage which celebrated it. Thus, in passing through the cloisters, he made me remark the beautiful carvings of leaves and flowers wrought in stone with the most exquisite delicacy, and notwithstanding the lapse of centuries, retaining their sharpness as if fresh from the chisel, rivalling, as Scott has said, the real objects of which they were imitations. Nor herb nor floweret glistened there, but was carved in the cloister arches as fair. He pointed out also, among the carved work, a nun's head of much beauty, which he said Scott always stopped to admire, for the shearer had a wonderful eye for all sic matters. I would observe that Scott seemed to derive more consequence in the neighborhood from being sheriff of the county than from being poet. In the interior of the Abbey, Johnny Bower conducted me to the identical stone on which stout William of Deloraine and the monk took their seat on that memorable night when the wizard's book was to be rescued from the grave. Nay, Johnny had even gone beyond Scott in the minuteness of his antiquarian research, for he had discovered the very tomb of the wizard, the position of which had been left in doubt by the poet. This he boasted to have ascertained by the position of the oriel window, and the direction in which the moonbeams fell at night, through the stained glass, casting the shadows to the red cross on the spot, as had all been specified in the poem. "I pointed out the hole to the shirra," said he, "and he couldna gainsay but it was ver clear." I found afterward that Scott used to amuse himself with the simplicity of the old man, and his zeal in verifying every passage of the poem, as though it had authentic history, and that he always acquiesced in his deductions. I subjoin the description of the wizard's grave, which called forth the antiquarian research of Johnny Bower. "Lo, warrior, now the cross of red points to the grave of the mighty dead. Slow moved the monk to the broad flag stone, which the bloody cross was traced upon. He pointed to a sacred nook, an iron bar the warrior took, and the monk made a sign with his withered hand, the grave's huge portal to expand. It was by dint of passing strength that he moved the massy stone at length. I would you had been there to see how the light broke forth so gloriously, streamed upward to the chancel roof, and through the galleries far aloof, and, issuing from the tomb, showed the monk's cowl and visage pale, danced on the dark brown warrior's mail, and kissed his waving plume. Before their eyes the wizard lay, as if he had not been dead a day. His hoary beard in silver rolled, he seemed some 70 winters old. A palmer's amice wrapped him round, with a wrought Spanish baldry bound, like a pilgrim from beyond the sea. His left hand held his book of might, a silver cross was in his right, the lamp was placed beside his knee. The fictions of Scott had become facts with honest Johnny Bower. From constantly living among the ruins of Melrose Abbey, and pointing out the scenes of the poem, the Lay of the Last Minstrel had, in a manner, become interwoven with his whole existence, and I doubt whether he did not now and then mix up his own identity with the personages of some of its cantos. He could not bear that any other production of the poet should be preferred to the Lay of the Last Minstrel. "Faith," said he to me, "is just even as good a thing as Mr. Scott has written, and if he were standing there I'd tell him so, and then he'd laugh." He was loud in his praises of the affability of Scott. "He'll come here sometimes," said he, "with great folks in his company, and the first I know of it is his voice calling out 'Johnny, Johnny Bower,' and when I go out, I am sure to be greeted with a joke or a pleasant word. He'll stand and crack and laugh with me just like an old wife, and to think that of a man who has such a awful knowledge o' history." One of the ingenious devices on which the worthy little man prided himself was to place a visitor opposite to the Abbey, with his back to it, and bid him bend down and look at it between his legs. This, he said, gave an entire different aspect to the ruin. Folks admired the plan amazingly, but as to the ladies, they were dainty on the matter, and contented themselves with looking from under their arms. As Johnny Bower piqued himself upon showing everything laid down in the poem, there was one passage that perplexed him sadly. It was the opening of one of the cantos. "If thou wouldst view fair Melrose aright, go visit it by the pale moonlight, for the gay beams of light some day gild but to flout the ruins grey," etc. In consequence of this admonition, many of the most devout pilgrims to the ruin could not be contented with a daylight inspection, and insisted it could be nothing unless seen by the light of the moon. Now, unfortunately, the moon shines but for part of the month, and, what is still more unfortunate, is very apt in Scotland to be obscured by clouds and mists. Johnny was sorely puzzled, therefore, how to accommodate his poetry-struck visitors with this indispensable moonshine. At length, in a lucky moment, he devised a substitute. This was a great double tallow candle stuck upon the end of a pole, with which he could conduct his visitors about the ruins on dark nights, so much to their satisfaction that, at length, he began to think it even preferable to the moon itself. "It does not light up the Abbey at since, to be sure," he would say, "but then ye can shift it about and show the old ruin bit by bit, whiles the moon only shines on one side." Honest Johnny Bower! So many years have elapsed since the time I treat of, that it is more than probable his simple head lies beneath the walls of his favorite abbey. It is to be hoped his humble ambition has been gratified, and his name recorded by the pen of the man he so loved and honored. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 2 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford, Part 2. After my return from Melrose Abbey, Scott proposed a ramble to show me something of the surrounding country. As we sallied forth, every dog in the establishment turned out to attend us. There was the old stag-hound, Maida, that I have already mentioned, a noble animal, and a great favorite of Scott's, and Hamlet, the black greyhound, a wild, thoughtless youngster, not yet arrived to the years of discretion, and Finette, a beautiful setter, with soft silken hair, long pendant ears, and a mild eye, the parlor favorite. When in front of the house, we were joined by a superannuated greyhound, who came from the kitchen wagging his tail, and was cheered by Scott as an old friend and comrade. In our walks Scott would frequently pause in conversation to notice his dogs and speak to them, as if rational companions. And indeed there appears to be a vast deal of rationality in these faithful attendants on man, derived from their close intimacy with him. Maida deported himself with great gravity becoming his age and size, and seemed to consider himself called upon to preserve a great degree of dignity and decorum in our society. As he jogged along a little distance ahead of us, the young dogs would gambol about him, leap on his neck, worry at his ears, and endeavor to tease him into a frolic. The old dog would keep on for a long time, with imperturbable solemnity, now and then seeming to rebuke the wantonness of his young companions. At length he would make a sudden turn, seize one of them, and tumble him in the dust, then giving a glance at us as much to say, "You see, gentlemen, I can't help giving way to this nonsense," would resume his gravity and jog on as before. Scott amused himself with these peculiarities. "I make no doubt," said he, "when Maida is alone with these young dogs, he throws gravity aside, and plays the boy as much as any of them; but he is ashamed to do so in our company, and seems to say, 'Ha! Done with your nonsense, youngsters. What will the laird and that other gentleman think of me, if I give way to such foolery?'" Maida reminded him, he said, of a scene on board an armed yacht, in which he made an excursion with his friend Adam Ferguson. They had taken much notice of the boatswain, who was a fine, sturdy seaman, and evidently felt flattered by their attention. On one occasion the crew were piped to fun, and the sailors were dancing and cutting all kinds of capers to the music of the ship's band. The boatswain looked on with a wistful eye, as if he would like to join in, but a glance at Scott and Ferguson showed that there was a struggle with his dignity, fearing to lessen himself in their eyes. At length one of his messmates came up, and seizing him by the arm, challenged him to a jig. The boatswain, continued Scott, after a little hesitation complied, made an awkward gambol or two, like our friend Maida, but soon gave it up. "It's of no use," said he, jerking up his waistband and giving a side glance at us. One can't dance always 'nother." Scott amused himself with the peculiarities of another of his dogs, a little shamefaced terrier, with large glassy eyes, one of the most sensitive little bodies to insult and indignity in the world. If ever he whipped him, he said, the little fellow would sneak off and hide himself from the light of day, in a lumber garret, whence there was no drawing him forth but by the sound of the chopping knife, as if chopping up his victuals, when he would steal forth with humble and downcast look, but would skulk away again if any one regarded him. While we were discussing the humors and peculiarities of our canine companions, some object provoked their spleen, and produced a sharp and petulant barking from the smaller fry. But it was some time before Maida was sufficiently aroused to ramp forward 2 or 3 bounds, and join us in the chorus, with a deep-mouthed bow-wow. It was but a transient outbreak, and he returned instantly, wagging his tail and looking up dubiously in his master's face, uncertain whether he would censure or applaud. "Ay, ay, old boy!" cried Scott, "you have done wonders. You have shaken the Eildon hills with your roaring. You may now lay by your artillery for the rest of the day. Maida is like the great gun at Constantinople," continued he. "It takes so long to get it ready, that the small guns can fire off a dozen times first. But when it does go off, it plays the very blank." These simple anecdotes may serve to show the delightful play of Scott's humors and feelings in private life. His domestic animals were his friends. Everything about him seemed to rejoice in the light of his countenance. The face of the humblest dependent brightened at his approach, as if he anticipated a cordial and cheering word. I had occasion to observe this particularly in a visit which we paid to a quarry, whence several men were cutting stone for the new edifice, who all paused from their labor to have a pleasant crack with a laird. One of them was a burgess of Selkirk, with whom Scott had some joke about the old song, "Up with the Souters o' Selkirk, and down with the Earl of Horn." Another was precentor at the kirk, and besides, leading the psalmody on Sunday, taught the lads and lasses of the neighborhood dancing on week-days, in the winter-time, when out-of-door labor was scarce. Among the rest was a tall, straight old fellow, with a healthful complexion and silver hair, and a small round-crowned white hat. He had been about to shoulder a nod, but paused, and stood looking at Scott, with a slight sparkling of his blue eye, as if waiting his turn, for the old fellow knew himself to be a favorite. Scott accosted him in an affable tone, and asked for a pinch of snuff. The old man drew forth a horn snuff-box. "Hoot, man," said Scott, "not that old mule. Where's the bonny French one that I brought you from Paris?" "Troth, your honour," replied the old fellow, "sic a mull as that is nae for week-days." On leaving the quarry, Scott informed me that when absent at Paris he had purchased several trifling articles as presents for his dependents, and among others the gay snuff-box in question, which was so carefully reserved for Sundays by the veteran. It was not so much the value of the gifts, said he, that pleased them, as the idea that the laird should think of them when so far away. The old man in question, I found, was a great favorite with Scott. If I recollect right, he had been a soldier in early life, and his straight, erect person, his ruddy yet rugged countenance, his gray hair, and an arch gleam in his blue eye, reminded me of the description of Edie Ochiltree. I find that the old fellow has since been introduced by Wilkie in his picture of the Scott family. We rambled on among scenes which have been familiar in Scottish song, and rendered classic by pastoral muse, long before Scott had thrown the rich mantle of his poetry over them. What a thrill of pleasure did I feel when I first saw the broom-covered tops of the Cowden Knowes, peeping above the great hills of the Tweed, and what touching associations were called up by the sight of Ettrick Vale, Gala Water, and the Braes of Yarrow. Every turn brought to mind some household air, some almost forgotten song of the nursery, by which I had been lulled to sleep in my childhood, and with them the looks and voices of those who had sung them, and who were now no more. It is these melodies, chanted in our ears in the days of infancy, and connected with the memory of those we have loved, and who have passed away, that clothe Scottish landscape with such tender associations. The Scottish songs in general have something intrinsically melancholy in them, owing, in all probability, to the pastoral and lonely life of those who compose them, who are often mere shepherds, tending their flocks in the solitary glens, or folding them among the naked hills. Many of these rustic bards have passed away without leaving a name behind. Nothing remains of them but their sweet and touching songs, which live, like echoes, about the places they once inhabited. Most of these simple effusions of pastoral poets are linked with some favorite haunt of the poet, and in this way, not a mountain or valley, a town or tower, green shaw or running stream in Scotland, but has some popular air connected with it, that makes its very name a key-note to a whole train of delicious fancies and feelings. Let me step forward in time and mention how sensible I was to the power of these simple airs, in a visit which I made to Ayr, the birthplace of Robert Burns. I passed a whole morning about the banks and braes of Bonny Doon, with his tender little love verses running in my head. I found a poor Scottish carpenter at work among the ruins of Kirk Alloway, which was to be converted into a schoolhouse. Finding the purpose of my visit, he left his work, sat down with me on a grassy grave close by where Burns's father was buried, and talked of the poet, whom he had known personally. He said his songs were familiar to the poorest and most illiterate of the country folk, and it seemed to him as if the country had grown more beautiful since Burns had written his bonny little songs about it. I found Scott was quite an enthusiast on the subject of the popular songs of his country, and he seemed gratified to find me so alive to them. Their effect in calling up in my mind the recollections of early times and scenes in which I had first heard them, reminded him, he said, of the lines of his poor men, Lydon, the Scottish muse. In youth's first morn, alert and gay, ere rolling years had passed away, remembered like a morning dream, I heard the dulcet measures float, in many a liquid winding note, along the bank of Teviot's stream. Sweet sounds that oft had soothed to rest the sorrows of my guileless breast, and charmed away mine infant tears. Fond memory shall your strains repeat, like distant echoes, doubly sweet, that on the wild the traveller hears. Scott went on to expatiate on the popular songs of Scotland. They are a part of our national inheritance, said he, and something that we may truly call our own. They have no foreign taint. They have the pure breath of the heather and the mountain breeze. All genuine legitimate races that have descended from the ancient Britons, such as the Scotch, the Welsh, and the Irish, have national airs. The English have none, because they are not natives of the soil, or, at least, are mongrels. Their music is all made up of foreign scraps, like a harlequin jacket, or a piece of mosaic. Even in Scotland we have comparatively few national songs in the eastern part, where we have had most influx of strangers. A real old Scottish song is a cairngorm, a gem of our own mountains, or rather, it is a precious relic of old times, that bears the national character stamped upon it, like a cameo, that shows what the national visage was in former days, before the breed was crossed. While Scott was thus discoursing, we were passing up a narrow glen, with the dogs beating about, to right and left, when suddenly a black cock burst upon the wing. "Aha!" cried Scott, "there will be a good shot for Master Walter. We must send him this way with his gun when we go home. Walter's the family sportsman now, and keeps us in game. I have pretty nigh resigned my gun to him, for I find I cannot trudge about as briskly as formerly." Our ramble took us on the hills commanding an extensive prospect. "Now," said Scott, "I have brought you, like the pilgrim in the Pilgrim's Progress, to the top of the Delectable Mountains, that I may show you all the goodly regions hereabouts." Yonder is Llanmere and Smallholm, and there you have Galshiels and Torwoody and Galwater, and in that direction you'll see Teviotdale and the Braes of Yarrow, and Ettrick stream, winding along like a silver thread to throw itself into the Tweed." He went on thus to call over names celebrated in Scottish song, and most of which had recently received a romantic interest from his own pen. In fact, I saw a great part of the border country spread out before me, and could trace the scenes of those poems and romances which had, in a manner, bewitched the world. I gazed about me for a time with mute surprise, I may also say with disappointment. I beheld a mere succession of grey waving hills, line beyond line, as far as my eye could reach, monotonous in their aspect, and so destitute of trees that one could almost see a stout fly walking along their profile, and the far famed Tweed appeared a naked stream, flowing between bare hills, without a tree or thicket on its banks. And yet such had been the magic web of poetry and romance thrown over the whole, that it had a greater charm for me than the richest scenery I beheld in England. I could not help giving utterance to my thoughts. Scott hummed for a moment to himself, and looked grave. He had no idea of having his muse complimented at the expense of his native hills. "It may be partiality," said he at length, "but to my eye these grey hills and all this wild border country have beauties peculiar to themselves. I like the very nakedness of the land. It has something bold and stern and solitary about it. When I have been for some time in the rich scenery about Edinburgh, which is like ornamented garden land, I begin to wish myself back again among my own honest grey hills, and if I did not see the heather at least once a year, I think I should die." The last words were said with an honest warmth, accompanied with a thump on the ground with his staff, by way of emphasis, that showed his heart was in his speech. He vindicated the Tweed, too, as a beautiful stream in itself, and observed that he did not dislike it for being bare of trees, probably from having been much of an angler in his time, and an angler does not like to have a stream overhung by trees, which embarrass him in the exercise of his rod and line. I took occasion to plead, in like manner, the associations of early life, for my disappointment in respect to the surrounding scenery. I had been so accustomed to hills crowned with forests, and streams breaking their way through a wilderness of trees, that all my ideas of romantic landscape were apt to be well wooded. "Ay, and that's the great charm of your country," cried Scott. "You love the forest, as I do the heather, but I would not have you think I do not feel the glory of a great woodland prospect. There's nothing I should like more than to be in the midst of one of your grand, wild, original forests, with the idea of hundreds of miles of untrodden forest around me. I once saw at Leith an immense stick of timber, just landed from America. It must have been an enormous tree when it stood on its native soil, at its full height, and with all its branches. I gazed at it with admiration. It seemed like one of the gigantic obelisks which are now and then brought from Egypt, to shame the pygmy monuments of Europe; and, in fact, these vast aboriginal trees, that have sheltered the Indians before the intrusion of the white men, are the monuments and antiquities of your country." The conversation here turned upon Campbell's poem of Gertrude of Wyoming, as illustrative of the poetic materials furnished by American scenery. Scott spoke of it in that liberal style which I always found him to speak of the writings of his contemporaries. He cited several passages of it with great delight. "What a pity it is," said he, "that Campbell does not write more and oftener, and give full sweep to his genius. He has wings that would bear him to the skies, and he does now and then spread them grandly, but folds them up again, and resumes his perch, as if he was afraid to launch away. He don't know or won't trust his own strength. Even when he has done a thing well, he has often misgivings about it. He left out several fine passages of his Lochiel, but I got him to restore some of them. Here Scott repeated several passages in a magnificent style. "What a grand idea is that," said he, "about prophetic boding, or, in common parlance, second sight. Coming events cast their shadows before. It is a noble thought, and nobly expressed. And there's that glorious little poem, too, of homeland, and after he had written it, he did not seem to think much of it, but considered some of it blank drum and trumpet lines. I got him to recite it to me, and I believe that the delight I felt and expressed had an effect in inducing him to print it. The fact is," added he, "Campbell is, in a manner, a bugbear to himself. The brightness of his early success is a detriment to all his further efforts. He is afraid of the shadow that his own fame casts before him." While we were thus chatting, we heard the report of a gun among the hills. "That's Walter, I think," said Scott. "He has finished his morning studies, and is out with his gun. I should not be surprised if he had met with the blackcock. If so, we shall have an addition to our larder, for Walter is a pretty good shot." I inquired into the nature of Walter's studies. "Faith," said Scott, "I can't say much on that head. I am not over bent upon making prodigies of any of my children. As to Walter, I taught him, while a boy, to ride and shoot and speak the truth. As to the other parts of his education, I leave them to a very worthy young man, the son of one of our clergymen, who instructs all my children." I afterward became acquainted with the young man in question, George Thompson, son of the minister of Melrose, and found him possessed of much learning, intelligence, and modest worth. He used to come every day from his father's residence at Melrose, to superintend the studies of the young folks, and occasionally took his meals at Abbotsford, where he was highly esteemed. Nature had cut him out, Scott used to say, for a stalwart soldier, for he was tall, vigorous, active, and fond of athletic exercises, but accident had marred her work, the loss of a limb in boyhood having reduced him to a wooden leg. He was brought up, therefore, for the church, whence he was occasionally called the Dominie, and is supposed, by his mixture of learning, simplicity, and amiable eccentricity, to have furnished many traits for the character of Dominie Sampson. I believe he often acted as Scott's amanuensis when composing his novels. With him the young people were occupied in general during the early part of the day, after which they took all kinds of healthful recreations in the open air, for Scott was as solicitous to strengthen their bodies as their minds. We had not walked much further before we saw the two Miss Scotts advancing along the hillside to meet us. The morning studies being over, they had set off to take a ramble on the hills, and gather heather blossoms, with which to decorate their hair for dinner. As they came bounding lightly like young fawns, and their dresses fluttering in the pure summer breeze, I was reminded of Scott's own description of his children in his introduction to one of the cantos of Marmion. "My imps, though hardy, bold, and wild, as best befits the mountain child, their summer gambols tell and mourn, and anxious ask, will spring return, and birds and lambs again be gay, and blossoms clothe the hawthorn spray. Yes, prattlers, yes, the daisy's flower again shall paint your summer bower, again the hawthorn shall supply the garlands you delight to tie. The lambs upon the lea shall bound, the wild birds carol to the round, and while you frolic light as they, too short shall seem the summer day." As they approached, the dogs all sprang forward and gambolled around them. They played with them for a time, and then joined us with countenances full of health and glee. Sophia, the eldest, was the most lively and joyous, having much of her father's varied spirit in conversation, and seeming to catch excitement from his words and looks. Anne was of quieter mood, rather silent, owing, in some measure, no doubt, to her being some years younger. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 3 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford, Part 3. At dinner, Scott had laid by his half-rustic dress, and appeared clad in black. The girls, too, in completing their toilet, had twisted in their hair the sprigs of purple heather which they had gathered on the hillside, and looked all fresh and blooming from their breezy walk. There was no guest at dinner but myself. Around the table were 2 or 3 dogs in attendance. Maida, the old staghound, took his seat at Scott's elbow, looking up wistfully in his master's eye, while Finette, the pet spaniel, placed herself near Mrs. Scott, by whom, I soon perceived, she was completely spoiled. The conversation happening to turn on the merits of his dogs, Scott spoke with great feeling and affection of his favorite, Camp, who was depicted by his side in the earlier engravings of him. He talked of him as of a real friend whom he had lost, and Sophia Scott, looking up archly in his face, observed that Papa shed a few tears when poor Camp died. I may here mention another testimonial of Scott's fondness for his dogs, and his humorous mode of showing it, which I subsequently met with, rambling with him one morning about the grounds adjacent to the house. I observed a small antique monument, on which was inscribed, in Gothic characters, Sigit le brave Percy. Here lies the brave Percy. I paused, supposing it to be the tomb of some stark warrior of the olden time, but Scott drew me on. "Pooh!" cried he, "it's nothing but one of the monuments of my nonsense, of which you'll find enough hereabouts." I learned afterward that it was the grave of a favorite greyhound. Among the other important and privileged members of the household who figured in attendance at the dinner was a large grey cat, who, I observed, was regaled from time to time with titbits from the table. This sage grimalkin was a favorite of both master and mistress, and slept at night in their room, and Scott laughingly observed that one of the least wise parts of their establishment was, that the window was left open at night for puss to go in and out. The cat assumed a kind of ascendancy among the quadrupeds, sitting in state in Scott's armchair, and occasionally stationing himself on a chair beside the door, as if to review his subjects as they passed, giving each dog a cuff beside the ears as he went by. This clapper clawing was always taken in good part. It appeared to be, in fact, a mere act of sovereignty on the part of Grimalkin, to remind the others of their vassalage, which they acknowledged by the most perfect acquiescence. A general harmony prevailed between sovereign and subjects, and they would all sleep together in the sunshine. Scott was full of anecdote and conversation during dinner. He made some admirable remarks upon the Scottish character, and spoke strongly in praise of the quiet, orderly, honest conduct of his neighbors, which one would hardly expect, said he, from the descendants of moss troopers and borderers, in a neighborhood famed in old times for brawl and feud, and violence of all kinds. He said he had, in his official capacity of sheriff, administered the laws for a number of years, during which there had been very few trials. The old feuds and local interests and rivalries and animosities of the Scotch, however, still slept, he said, in their ashes, and might easily be roused. Their hereditary feeling for names was still great. It was not always safe to have even the game of football between villages. The old clannish spirit was too apt to break out. The Scotch, he said, were more revengeful than the English. They carried their resentments longer, and would sometimes lay them by for years, but would be sure to gratify them in the end. The ancient jealousy between the Highlanders and the Lowlanders still continued to a certain degree, the former looking upon the latter as an inferior race, less brave and hardy, but at the same time suspecting them of a disposition to take airs upon themselves under the idea of superior refinement. This made them tetchy and ticklish company for a stranger on his first coming among them, ruffling up and putting themselves upon their mettle on the slightest occasion, so that he had in a manner to quarrel and fight his way into their good graces. He instanced a case in point in a brother of Mungo Park, who went to take up his residence in a wild neighborhood of the Highlands. He soon found himself considered as an intruder, and that there was a disposition among these cocks of the hills to fix a quarrel on him, trusting that, being a Lowlander, he would show the white feather. For a time he bore their flings and taunts with great coolness, until one, presuming on his forbearance, drew forth a dirk, and holding it before him, asked him if he had ever seen a weapon like that in his part of the country. Park, who was a Hercules in frame, seized the dirk, and with one blow drove it through an oaken table. "Yes," replied he, "and tell your friends that a man from Lowlands drove it where the devil himself cannot draw it out again." All persons were delighted with the feat, and the words that accompanied it. They drank with Park to a better acquaintance, and were staunch friends ever afterwards. After dinner we adjourned to the drawing-room, which served also for study and library. Against the wall on one side was a long writing-table, with drawers, surmounted by a small cabinet of polished wood, with folding doors richly studded with brass ornaments, within which Scott kept his most valuable papers. Above the cabinet, in a kind of niche, was a complete corslet of glittering steel, with a closed helmet and flanked by gauntlets and battle-axes. Around were hung trophies and relics of various kinds, a scimitar of Tippoo Sahib, a Highland broadsword from Flodden Field, a pair of Ripon spurs from Bannockburn, and above all, a gun which had belonged to Rob Roy, and bore his initials R.M.G., an object of peculiar interest to me at the time, as it was understood Scott was actually engaged in printing a novel founded on the story of that famous outlaw. On each side of the cabinet were bookcases, well stored with works of romantic fiction in various languages, many of them rare and antiquated. This, however, was merely his cottage library, the principal part of his books being at Edinburgh. From this little cabinet of curiosities, Scott drew forth a manuscript picked up on the field of Waterloo, containing copies of several songs popular at the time in France. The paper was dabbled with blood. "The very life-blood, very possibly," said Scott, "of some gay young officer, who had cherished these songs as a keepsake from some lady love in Paris." He adverted, in a mellow and delightful manner, to the little half-gay, half-melancholy campaigning song, said to have been composed by General Wolfe, and sung by him at the mess table on the eve of the storming of Quebec, in which he fell so gloriously. "Why, soldiers, why should we be melancholy, boys? Why, soldiers, why, whose business 'tis to die? For should next campaign send us to him who made us, boys, we're free from pain, but should we remain, a bottle and kind landlady makes all well again." "So," added he, "the poor lad who fell at Waterloo, in all probability, had been singing these songs in his tent the night before the battle, and thinking of the fair dame who had taught him them, and promising himself, should he outlive the campaign, to return to her all glorious from the wars." I find since that Scott published translations of these songs among some of his smaller poems. The evening passed away delightfully in this quaint-looking apartment, half study, half drawing-room. Scott read several passages from the old romance of Arthur, with a fine, deep, sonorous voice, and a gravity of tone that seemed to suit the antiquated black-letter volume. It was a rich treat to hear such a work, read by such a person, and in such a place, and his appearance as he sat reading in a large arm-chair with his favorite hound Maida at his feet, and surrounded by books and relics and border trophies, would have formed an admirable and most characteristic picture. While Scott was reading, the sage grimalkin, already mentioned, had taken his seat in a chair beside the fire, and remained with fixed eye and grave demeanor, as if listening to the reader. I observed to Scott that his cat seemed to have a black-letter taste in literature. "Ah," said he, "these cats are a very mysterious kind of folk. There is always more passing in their minds than we are aware of. It comes no doubt from their being so familiar with witches and warlocks." He went on to tell a little story about a gudeman who was returning to his cottage one night, when, in a lonely out-of-the-way place, he met with a funeral procession of cats all one morning, bearing one of their race to the grave in a coffin covered with a black velvet pall. The worthy man, astonished and half frightened at so strange a pageant, hastened home and told what he had seen to his wife and children. Scarce had he finished when a great black cat that sat beside the fire raised himself up, exclaimed, "Then I am king of the cats," and vanished up the chimney. The funeral seen by the good man was one of the cat dynasty. "Our grimalkin here," added Scott, "sometimes reminds me of the story, by the airs of sovereignty which he assumes, and I am apt to treat him with respect from the idea that he may be a great prince incognito, and may some time or another come to the throne." In this way Scott would make the habits and peculiarities of even the dumb animals about him subjects for humorous remark or whimsical story. Our evening was enlivened also by an occasional song from Sophia Scott, at the request of her father. She never wanted to be asked twice, but complied frankly and cheerfully. Her songs were all Scotch, sung without any accompaniment, in a simple manner, but with great spirit and expression, and in their native dialects, which gave them an additional charm. It was delightful to hear her carol off in sprightly style, and with an animated air, some of those generous-spirited old Jacobite songs, once current among the adherents of the Pretender in Scotland, in which she is designated by the appellation of the Young Chevalier. These songs were much relished by Scott, notwithstanding his loyalty, for the unfortunate Chevalier has always been a hero of romance with him, as he has with many other staunch adherents to the House of Hanover, now that the Stuart line has lost all its terrors. And speaking on this subject, Scott mentioned as a curious fact, that, among the papers of the Chevalier, which had been submitted by government to his inspection, he had found a memorial to Charles from some adherents in America, dated 1778, proposing to set up his standard in the back settlements. I regret that, at the time, I did not make more particular inquiries of Scott on the subject. The document in question, however, in all probability, still exists among the Pretender's papers, which are in the possession of the British government. In the course of the evening Scott related the story of a whimsical picture hanging in the room, which had been drawn for him by a lady of his acquaintance. It represented the doleful perplexity of a wealthy and handsome young English knight of the olden time, who, in the course of a border foray, had been captured and carried off to the castle of a hard-headed and high-handed old baron. The unfortunate youth was thrown into a dungeon, and a tall gallows erected before the castle gate for his execution. When all was ready, he was brought into the castle hall where the grim baron was seated in state, with his warriors armed to the teeth around him, and was given his choice, either to swing on the gibbet or to marry the baron's daughter. The last may be thought an easy alternative, but unfortunately the baron's young lady was hideously ugly, with a mouth from ear to ear, so that not a suitor was to be had for her, either for love or money, and she was known throughout the border country by the name of Muckle-mouthed Mag. The picture in question represented the unhappy dilemma of the handsome youth. Before him sat the grim baron, with a face worthy of the father of such a daughter, and looking daggers and ratsbane. On one side of him was muckle-mouthed Mag, with an amorous smile across the whole breadth of her countenance, and a leer enough to turn a man to stone. On the other side was the father confessor, a sleek friar, jogging the youth's elbow, and pointing to the gallows, seen in perspective through the open portal. The story goes that after long laboring in mind, between the altar and the halter, the love of life prevailed, and the youth resigned himself to the charms of muckle-mouthed Mag. Contrary to all the probabilities of romance, the match proved a happy one. The Baron's daughter, if not beautiful, was a most exemplary wife. Her husband was never troubled with any of those doubts and jealousies which sometimes mar the happiness of connubial life, and was made the father of a fair and undoubtedly legitimate hue which still flourishes on the border. I give but a faint outline of the story from vague recollections. It may, perchance, be more richly related elsewhere, by some one who may retain something of the delightful humour with which Scott recounted it. When I retired for the night, I found it almost impossible to sleep. The idea of being under the roof of Scott, of being on the borders of the Tweed, in the very centre of that region which had for some time past been the favourite scene of romantic fiction, and above all, the recollections of the ramble I had taken, the company in which I had taken it, and the conversation which had passed, all fermented in my mind, and nearly drove sleep from my pillow. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 4 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Chapter 4 Abbotsford, Part 4. On the following morning the sun darted his beams from over the hills through the low lattice window. I rose at an early hour, and looked out between the branches of eglantine which overhung the casement. To my surprise, Scott was already up and forth, seated on a fragment of stone, and chatting with the workmen employed on the new building. I had supposed, after the time he had wasted upon me yesterday, he would be closely occupied this morning, but he appeared like a man of leisure, who had nothing to do but bask in the sunshine and amuse himself. I soon dressed myself and joined him. He talked about his proposed plans of Abbotsford. Happy would it have been for him could he have contented himself with his delightful little vine-covered cottage, in the simple yet hearty and hospitable style in which he lived at the time of my visit. The great pile of Abbotsford, with the huge expense it entailed upon him, of servants, retainers, guests, and baronial style, was a drain upon his purse, a tax upon his exertions, and a weight upon his mind that finally crushed him. As yet, however, all was in embryo and perspective, and Scott pleased himself with picturing out his future residence, as he would one of the fanciful creations of his own romances. It was one of his air castles, he said, which he was reducing to solid stone and mortar. About the place were strewed various morsels from the ruins of Melrose Abbey, which were to be incorporated in his mansion. He had already constructed out of similar materials a kind of Gothic shrine over a spring, and had surmounted it by a small stone cross. Among the relics from the Abbey which lay scattered before us was a most quaint and antique little lion, either of red stone or painted red, which hit my fancy. I forgot whose cognizance it was, but I shall never forget the delightful observations concerning old Melrose to which it accidentally gave rise. The Abbey was evidently a pile that called up all Scott's poetic and romantic feelings, and one to which he was enthusiastically attached by the most fanciful and delightful of his early associations. He spoke of it, I may say, with affection. "There is no telling," said he, "what treasures are hid in that glorious old pile. It is a famous place for antiquarian plunder. There are such rich bits of old-time sculpture for the architect, and old-time story for the poet. There is as rare picking in it as a Stilton cheese, and in the same taste, the mouldier the better. He went on to mention circumstances of mighty import connected with the Abbey, which had never been touched, and which had even escaped the researches of Johnny Bower. The heart of Robert Bruce, the hero of Scotland, had been buried in it. He dwelt on the beautiful story of Bruce's pious and chivalrous request in his dying hour, that his heart might be carried to the Holy Land and placed in the Holy Sepulchre, in fulfilment of a vow of pilgrimage, and of the loyal expedition of Sir James Douglas to convey the glorious relic. Much might be made, he said, out of the adventures of Sir James in that adventurous age, of his fortunes in Spain, and his death in a crusade against the Moors, with the subsequent fortunes of the heart of Robert Bruce, until it was brought back to its native land, and enshrined within the holy walls of old Melrose. As Scott sat on a stone talking in this way, and knocking with his staff against a little red lion which lay prostrate before him, his grey eyes twinkled beneath his shagged eyebrows. Scenes, images, incidents, kept breaking upon his mind as he proceeded, mingled with the touches of the mysterious and supernatural as connected with the heart of Bruce. It seemed as if a poem or romance were breaking vaguely on his imagination. That he subsequently contemplated something of the kind, as connected with this subject, and with his favourite ruin of Melrose, is evident from his introduction to the monastery, and it is a pity that he never succeeded in following out these shadowy but enthusiastic conceptions. A summons to breakfast broke off our conversation, when I begged to recommend to Scott's attention my friend the Little Red Lion, who had led to such an interesting topic, and hoped he might receive some niche or station in the future castle, worthy of his evident antiquity and apparent dignity. Scott assured me, with comic gravity, that the valiant little lion should be most honourably entertained. I hope, therefore, that he still flourishes at Abbotsford. Before dismissing the theme of the relics from the Abbey, I will mention another, illustrative of Scott's varied humours. This was a human skull, which had probably belonged of yore to one of those jovial friars, so honourably mentioned in the old Border ballad. Oh, the monks of Melrose made good gale On Fridays when they fasted; They wanted neither beef nor ale, As long as their neighbours lasted. This skull he had caused to be cleaned and varnished, and placed it on a chest of drawers in his chamber, immediately opposite his bed, where I have seen it, grinning most dismally. It was an object of great awe and horror to the superstitious housemaids, and Scott used to amuse himself with their apprehensions. Sometimes, in changing his dress, he would leave his neckcloth coiled round it like a turban, and none of the lasses dared to remove it. It was a matter of great wonder and speculation among them that the laird should have such an awesome fancy for an old gurning skull. At breakfast that morning, Scott gave an amusing account of a little Highlander called Campbell of the North, who had a lawsuit of many years' standing with a nobleman in his neighbourhood about the boundaries of their estates. It was the leading object of the little man's life, the running theme of all his conversations. He used to detail all the circumstances at full length to everybody he met, and, to aid him in his description of the premises, and make his story more précis, he had a great map made of his estate, a huge roll several feet long, which he used to carry about on his shoulder. Campbell was a long-bodied, but short and bandy-legged little man, always clad in the Highland garb, and as he went about with his great roll on his shoulder, and his little legs curving like a pair of parentheses below his kilt, he was an odd figure to behold. He was like little David shouldering the spear of Goliath, which was like unto a weaver's beam. Whenever sheep shearing was over, Campbell used to set out for Edinburgh to attend to his lawsuit. At the inns he paid double for all his meals and his night's lodgings, telling the landlords to keep it in mind until his return, so that he might come back that way at free cost. For he knew, he said, that he would spend all his money among the lawyers at Edinburgh, so he thought it best to secure a retreat home again. On one of his visits he called upon his lawyer, but was told he was not at home. But his lady was. "It's just the same thing," said little Campbell. On being shown into the parlor, he unrolled his map, stated his case at full length, and, having gone through with his story, gave her the customary fee. She would have declined it, but he insisted on her taking it. "I had just as much pleasure," said he, "in telling the whole tale to you, as I should have had in telling it to your husband, and I believe full as much profit." The last time he saw Scott, he told him he believed he and the laird were near a settlement, as they agreed to within a few miles of the boundary. If I recollect right, Scott added that he advised the little man to consign his cause and his map to the care of Slow Willie Mowbray, of tedious memory, an Edinburgh worthy, much employed by the country people, for he tired out everybody in his office by repeated visits and drawling, endless prolixity, and gained every suit by dint of boring. These little stories and anecdotes, which abounded in Scott's conversation, rose naturally out of the subject, ere it were perfectly unforced, though, in thus relating them in a detached way, without the observations or circumstances which led to them, and which have passed from my recollection, they want their setting to give them proper relief. They will serve, however, to show the natural play of his mind, in its familiar moods, and its fecundity in graphic and characteristic detail. His daughter Sophia and his son Charles were those of his family who seemed most to feel and understand his humors, and to take delight in his conversation. Mrs. Scott did not always pay the same attention, and would now and then make a casual remark, which would operate a little like a damper. Thus, one morning at breakfast, when Dominie Thompson, the tutor, was present, Scott was going on with great glee to relate an anecdote of the Laird of Macnab, who, poor fellow, premised he, is dead and gone. "Why, Mr. Scott," exclaimed the good lady, "Macnab's not dead, is he?" "Faith, my dear," replied Scott, with humorous gravity, "if he's not dead, they've done him great injustice, for they've buried him." The joke passed harmless and unnoticed by Mrs. Scott, but hit the poor Dominie just as he had raised a cup of tea to his lips, causing a burst of laughter which sent half of the contents about the table. After breakfast, Scott was occupied for some time correcting proof sheets which he had received by the mail. The novel of Rob Roy, as I have already observed, was at that time in the press, and I suppose them to be the proof sheets of that work. The authorship of the Waverley novels was still a matter of conjecture and uncertainty, though few doubted their being principally written by Scott. One proof to me of his being the author was that he never adverted to them. A man so fond of anything Scottish, and anything relating to national history or local legend, could not have been mute respecting such productions, had they been written by another. He was fond of quoting the works of his contemporaries. He was continually reciting scraps of border songs, or relating anecdotes of border story. With respect to his own poems, and their merits, however, he was mute, and while with him I observed a scrupulous silence on the subject. I may here mention a singular fact, of which I was not aware at the time, that Scott was very reserved with his children respecting his own writings, and was even disinclined to their reading his romantic poems. I learnt this, some time after, from a passage in one of his letters to me, adverting to a set of the American miniature edition of his poems, which, on my return to England, I forwarded to one of the young ladies. "In my hurry," writes he, "I have not thanked you, in Sophia's name, for the kind attention which furnished her with the American volumes. I am not quite sure I can add my own, since you have made her acquainted with much more of papa's folly than she would otherwise have learned, for I have taken special care they should never see any of these things during their earlier years." To return to the thread of my narrative. When Scott had gone through his brief literary occupation, we set out on a ramble. The young lady started to accompany us, But they had not gone far when they met a poor old laborer and his distressed family, and turned back to take them to the house and relieve them. On passing the bounds of Abbotsford, we came upon a bleak-looking farm, with a forlorn, crazy old manse or farmhouse, standing in naked desolation. This, however, Scott told me, was an ancient hereditary property called Lochend, about as valuable as the patrimonial estate of Don Quixote, and which, in like manner, conferred an hereditary dignity upon its proprietor, who was a laird, and though poor as a rat, prided himself upon his ancient blood and the standing of his house. He was accordingly called Lochend, according to the Scottish custom of naming a man after his family estate; but he was more generally known through the country round by the name of Lauckie Longlegs, from the length of his limbs. While Scott was giving this account of him, we saw him at a distance striding along one of his fields, with his plaid fluttering about him, and he seemed well to deserve his appellation, for he looked all legs and tartan. Lauckie knew nothing of the world beyond his neighborhood. Scott told me that on returning to Abbotsford from his visit to France, immediately after the war, he was called on by his neighbors generally to inquire after foreign parts. Among the number came Lauckie Longlegs, and an old brother as ignorant as himself. They had many inquiries to make about the French, whom they seemed to consider some remote and semi-barbarous horde. "And what like are the barbarians in their own country?" said Lauckie. "Can they write? Can they cipher?" He was quite astonished to learn that they were nearly as much advanced in civilization as the good folks of Abbotsford. After living for a long time in single blessedness, Lauckie all at once, and not long before my visit to the neighborhood, took it into his head to get married. The neighbors were all surprised, but the family connection, who were as proud as they were poor, were grievously scandalized, for they thought the young woman on whom he had set his mind quite beneath him. It was in vain, however, that they remonstrated on the misalliance he was about to make. He was not to be swayed from his determination. Arraying himself in his best, and saddling a gaunt steed that might have rivaled Rosinante, and placing a pillion behind his saddle, he departed to wed and bring home the humble lassie who was to be made mistress of the venerable hovel of Lochend, and who lived in a village on the opposite side of the Tweed. A small event of the kind makes a great stir in a little quiet country neighborhood. The word soon circulated through the village of Melrose, and the cottages in its vicinity, that Lauckie Longlegs had gone over the Tweed to fetch home his bride. All the good folks assembled at the bridge to await his return. Lauckie, however, disappointed them, for he crossed the river at a distant ford, and conveyed his bride safe to his mansion without being perceived. Let me step forward in the course of events, and relate the fate of poor Lauckie, as it was communicated to me a year or two afterward in letter by Scott. From the time of his marriage he had no longer any peace, owing to the constant intermeddling of his relations, who would not permit him to be happy in his own way, but endeavored to set him at variance with his wife. Lauckie refused to credit any of their stories to her disadvantage, but the incessant warfare he had to wage in defence of her good name wore out both flesh and spirit. His last conflict was with his own brothers, in front of his paternal mansion. A furious scolding match took place between them. Lauckie made a vehement profession of faith in favor of her immaculate honesty, and then fell dead at the threshold of his own door. His person, his character, his name, his story, and his fate entitled him to be immortalized in one of Scott's novels, and I looked to recognize him in some of the succeeding works from his pen, but I looked in vain. After passing by the domains of honest Lauckie, Scott pointed out, at a distance, the Eildon stone. There in ancient days stood the Eildon tree, beneath which Thomas the Rhymer, according to popular tradition, dealt forth his prophecies, some of which still exist in antiquated ballads. Here we turned up a little glen with a small burn or brook whimpering and dashing along it, making an occasional waterfall, and overhung in some places with mountain ash and weeping birch. "We are now," said Scott, "treading classic, or rather fairy ground. This is the haunted glen of Thomas the Rhymer, where he met with the Queen of Fairyland. And this is the Boggle Burn, or Goblin Brook, along which she rode on her dapple-gray palfrey, with silver bells ringing at the bridle. Here, said he, pausing, is Huntley Bank, on which Thomas the Rhymer lay musing and sleeping, when he saw, or dreamt he saw, the Queen of Elfland. True Thomas lay on Huntley Bank, a ferly he spied with his eye, and there he saw a lady bright, come riding down by the Eildon tree. Her skirt was o' the grass-green silk, her mantle o' the velvet fine, at ilka tet of her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. Here Scott repeated several of the stanzas, and recounted the circumstance of Thomas the Rhymer's interview with the fairy, and his being transported by her to Fairyland. Until 7 years were gone and past, true Thomas on earth was never seen. It's a fine old story, said he, and might be wrought up into a capital tale. Scott continued on, leading the way as usual, and limping up the Wizard Glen, talking as he went; but, as his back was toward me, I could only hear the deep, growling tones of his voice, like the low breathing of an organ, without distinguishing the words, until pausing, and turning his face toward me, I found he was reciting some scrap of border minstrelsy about Thomas the Rhymer. This was continually the case in my ramblings with him about this storied neighborhood. His mind was fraught with the traditionary fictions connected with every object around him, and he would breathe it forth as he went, apparently as much for his own gratification as for that of his companion. Nor hill nor brook we paced along, but had its legend or its song. His voice was deep and sonorous. He spoke with a Scottish accent, and with somewhat of the Northumbrian burr, which, to my mind, gave a Doric strength and simplicity to his elocution. His recitation of poetry was, at times, magnificent. I think it was in the course of this ramble that my friend Hamlet, the black greyhound, got into a bad scrape. The dogs were beating about the glens and fields as usual, and had been for some time out of sight, when we heard a barking at some distance to the left. Shortly after we saw some sheep scampering on the hills, with the dogs after them. Scott applied to his lips the ivory whistle, always hanging at his button-hole, and soon called in the culprits, excepting Hamlet. Hastening up a bank which commanded a view along a fold or hollow of the hills, we beheld the sable prince of Denmark standing by the bleeding body of a sheep. The carcass was still warm, the throat bore marks of the fatal grip, and Hamlet's muzzle was stained with blood. Never was culprit more completely caught in flagrante delicto. I suppose the doom of poor Hamlet to be sealed, for no higher offence can be committed by a dog in a country abounding with sheep walks. Scott, however, had a greater value for his dogs than for his sheep. They were his companions and friends. Hamlet, too, though an irregular, impertinent kind of youngster, was evidently a favorite. He would not for some time believe it could be he who had killed the sheep. It must have been some cur of the neighborhood that had made off on our approach and left poor Hamlet in the lurch. Proofs, however, were too strong, and Hamlet was generally condemned. "Well, well," said Scott, "it's partly my own fault. I have given up coursing for some time past, and the poor dog has had no chance after game to take the fire edge off of him. If he was put after a hare occasionally, he never would meddle with sheep." I understood, afterward, that Scott actually got a pony, and went out now and then coursing with Hamlet, who, in consequence, showed no further inclination for mutton. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 5 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford, Part 5. A further stroll among the hills brought us to what Scott pronounced the remains of a Roman camp, and as we sat upon a hillock, which had once formed a part of the ramparts, he pointed out the traces of the lines and bulwarks and the praetorium, and showed a knowledge of castravetation that would not have disgraced the antiquarian Old Buck himself. Indeed, various circumstances that I observed about Scott during my visit concurred to persuade me that many of the antiquarian humours of Monkbarns were taken from his own richly compounded character, and that some of the scenes and personages of that admirable novel were furnished by his immediate neighbourhood. He gave me several anecdotes of a noted pauper named Andrew Gemmells, or Gamel, as it was pronounced, who had once flourished on the banks of Gala Water, immediately opposite Abbotsford, and whom he had seen and talked and joked with when a boy. And I instantly recognized the likeness of that mirror of philosophic vagabonds and Nestor of beggars, E.D. Ochiltree. I was on the point of pronouncing the name and recognizing the portrait, when I recollected the incognito observed by Scott with respect to his novels, and checked myself, but it was one among many things that tended to convince me of his authorship. His picture of Andrew Gemmill exactly accorded with that of Edie as to his height, carriage, and soldier-like air, as well as his arch and sarcastic humor. His home, if home he had, was at Galashiels, but he went wandering about the country, along the green shaws and beside the burns, and was a kind of walking chronicle throughout the valleys of the Tweed, the Ettrick, and the Yarrow, carrying the gossip from house to house, commenting on the inhabitants and their concerns, and never hesitating to give them a dry rub as to any of their faults or follies. A shrewd beggar like Andrew Gamel, Scott added, who could sing the old Scotch airs, tell stories and traditions, and gossip away the long winter evenings, was by no means an unwelcome visitor at a lonely manse or cottage. The children would run to welcome him, and place his stool in a warm corner of the ingle nook, and the old folks would receive him as a privileged guest. As to Andrew, he looked upon them all as a parson does upon his parishioners, and considered the alms he received as much his due as the other does his tithes. I rather think, added Scott, Andrew considered himself more of a gentleman than those who toiled for a living, and that he secretly looked down upon the painstaking peasants that fed and sheltered him. He had derived his aristocratical notions in some degree from being admitted occasionally to a precarious sociability with some of the small country gentry, who were sometimes in want of company to help while away the time. With these Andrew would now and then play at cards and dice, and he never lacked siller and pouch to stake on a game, which he did with a perfect air of a man to whom money was a matter of little moment, and no one could lose his money with more gentlemanlike coolness. Among those who occasionally admitted him to this familiarity was old John Scott of Gala, a man of family, who inhabited his paternal mansion of Torwoodley. Some distinction of rank, however, was still kept up. The laird sat on the inside of the window, and the beggar on the outside, and they played cards on the sill. Andrew now and then told the laird a piece of his mind very freely, especially on one occasion when he had sold some of his paternal lands to build himself a larger house with the proceeds. The speech of honest Andrew smacks of the shrewdness of Edie Ochiltree. "It's a very weel, Torwoodley," said he. "But who would have thought that your father's son would have sold 2 good estates to build Shaw's cuckoo's nest on the side of a hill?" That day there was an arrival at Abbotsford of 2 English tourists, one a gentleman of fortune and landed estate, the other a young clergyman whom he appeared to have under his patronage, and to have brought with him as a travelling companion. The patron was one of those well-bred, commonplace gentlemen with which England is overrun. He had great deference for Scott, and endeavoured to acquit himself learnedly in his company, aiming continually at abstract disquisitions, for which Scott had little relish. The conversation of the latter, as usual, was studded with anecdotes and stories, some of them of great pith and humour. The well-bred gentleman was either too dull to feel their point, or too decorous to indulge in hearty merriment. The honest parson, on the contrary, was not too refined to be happy, laughed loud and long at every joke, and enjoyed them with the zest of a man who has more merriment in his heart than coin in his pocket. After they were gone, some comments were made upon their different deportments. Scott spoke very respectfully of the good breeding and measured manners of the man of wealth, but with a kindlier feeling of the honest parson, and the homely but hearty enjoyment with which he relished every pleasantry. "I doubt," said he, "whether the parson's lot in life is not the best. If he cannot command as many of the good things of this world by his own purse as his patron can, he beats him all hollow in his enjoyment of them when set before him by others. Upon the whole," added he, "I rather think I prefer the honest parson's good humour to his patron's good breeding. I have a great regard for a hearty laugher." He went on to speak of the great influx of English travellers which of late years had inundated Scotland, and doubted whether they had not injured the old-fashioned Scottish character. "Formerly they came here occasionally as sportsmen," said he, "to shoot moor game, without any idea of looking at scenery, and they moved about the country in hardy simple style, coping with the country people in their own way. But now they come rolling about in their equipages, to see ruins and spend money, and their lavish extravagance has played the vengeance with the common people. It has made them rapacious in their dealings with strangers, greedy after money, and extortionate in their demands for the most trivial services. Formerly," continued he, "the poorer classes of our people were, comparatively, disinterested. They offered their services gratuitously, in promoting the amusement, or aiding the curiosity of strangers, and were gratified by the smallest compensation. But now they make a trade of showing rocks and ruins, and are as greedy as Italian cicerones. They look upon the English as so many walking money bags. The more they are shaken and poked, the more they will leave behind them." I told him that he had a great deal to answer for on that head, since it was the romantic associations he had thrown by his writings over so many out-of-the-way places in Scotland that had brought in the influx of curious travellers. Scott laughed, and said he believed I might be in some measure in the right, as he recollected a circumstance in point. Being one time at Glen Ross, an old woman who kept a small inn, which had but little custom, was uncommonly officious in her attendance upon him, and absolutely incommoded him with her civilities. The secret at length came out. As he was about to depart, she addressed him with many curtsies, and said she understood he was the gentleman that had written a bonny book about Loch Katrine. She begged him to write a little about their lake also, for she understood his book had done the inn at Loch Katrine a muckle deal of good. On the following day I made an excursion with Scott and the young ladies to Dryburgh Abbey. We went in an open carriage, drawn by two sleek old black horses, for which Scott seemed to have an affection, as he had for every dumb animal that belonged to him. Our road lay through a variety of scenes, rich in poetical and historical associations, about most of which Scott had something to relate. In one part of the drive, he pointed to an old border keep, or fortress, on the summit of a naked hill several miles off, which he called Smallholm Tower, and a rocky knoll on which it stood, the Sandy Knowe Crags. It was a place, he said, peculiarly dear to him, from the recollections of childhood. His father had lived there in the old Smallholm Grange, or farmhouse, and he had been sent there, when but 2 years old, on account of his lameness, that he might have the benefit of the pure air of the hills, and be under the care of his grandmother and aunts. In the introduction of one of the cantos of Marmion, he has depicted his grandfather at the fireside of the farmhouse, and has given an amusing picture of himself in his boyish years. Still with vain fondness could I trace anew each kind familiar face, that brightened at our evening fire, from the thatched mansion's grey-haired sire, wise without learning, plain and good, and sprung of Scotland's gentler blood, whose eye in age, quick, clear, and keen, showed what in youth its glance had been. whose doom discording neighbors sought, content with equity unbought. To him the venerable priest, our frequent and familiar guest, whose life and manners well could paint alike the student and the saint. Alas, whose speech too oft I broke with gambol rude and timeless joke. For I was wayward, bold, and wild, a self-willed imp, a grandame's child. But half a plague and half a jest was still endured, beloved, carest. It was, he said, during his residence at Smallholm Crags, that he first imbibed his passion for legendary tales, border traditions, and old national songs and ballads. His grandmother and aunts were well versed in that kind of lore, so current in Scottish country life. They used to recount them in long, gloomy winter days, about the ingle nook at night, in conclave with their gossip visitors, and little Walter would sit and listen with greedy ear, thus taking into his infant mind the seeds of many a splendid fiction. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Chapter 6 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford, Part 6. There was an old shepherd, he said, in the service of the family, who used to sit under the sunny wall and tell marvelous stories, and recite old-time ballads, as he knitted stockings. Scott used to be wheeled out in his chair, in fine weather, and would sit beside the old man and listen to him for hours. The situation of Sandy Knowe was favorable both for storyteller and listener. It commanded a wide view over the border country, with its feudal towers, its haunted glens, and wizard streams. As the old shepherd told his tales, he could point out the very scene of action. Thus, before Scott could walk, he was made familiar with the scenes of his future stories. They were all seen as through a magic medium, and took that tinge of romance which they ever after retained in his imagination. From the height of Sandy Knowe, he may be said to have had the first look out upon the promised land of his future glory. On referring to Scott's works, I find many of the circumstances related in this conversation about the old tower and the boyish scenes connected with it, recorded in the introduction to Marmion, already cited. This was frequently the case with Scott. Incidents and feelings that had appeared in his writings were apt to be mingled up in his conversation, for they had been taken from what he had witnessed and felt in real life, and were connected with those scenes among which he lived, and moved, and had his being. I make no scruple at quoting the passage relative to the tower, though it repeats much of the foregone imagery, and with vastly superior effect. Thus, while I ape the measure wild of tales that charmed me yet a child, rude though they be, still with the chime return the thoughts of early time, and feelings roused in life's first day glow in the line and prompt the lay. Then rise those crags, that mountain tower, which charmed my fancy's wakening hour, though no broad river swept along to claim perchance heroic song, though sighed no groves in summer gale to prompt of love a softer tale, though scarce a puny streamlet's speed claimed homage from a shepherd's reed. It was poetic impulse given by the green hill and clear blue heaven. It was a barren scene and wild, where naked cliffs were rudely piled, but ever and anon between lay velvet tufts of loveliest green, and well the lonely infant knew recesses where the wallflower grew, and honeysuckle love to crawl up the low crag and ruined wall. I deemed such nooks the sweetest shade, the sun in all his round surveyed. And still I thought that shattered tower the mightiest work of human power, and marvelled as the aged hind with some strange tale bewitched my mind, of forayers who, with headlong force, down from that strength had spurred their horse, their southern rapine to renew, far in the distant Cheviot's blue, and, home returning, filled the hall with revel, wassail rout, and brawl. Methought that still, with tramp and clang, the gateway's broken arches rang. Methought grim features, seamed with scars, glared through the window's rusty bars. And ever by the winter hearth old tales I heard of woe or mirth, of lovers' sleights, of ladies' charms, of witches' spells, of warriors' arms, of patriot battles won of old by Wallace Wit and Bruce the Bold, of later fields of feud and fight, when pouring from the Highland height the Scottish clans in headlong sway had swept the scarlet ranks away, while stretched at length upon the floor again I fought each combat o'er. Pebbles and shells in order laid, the mimic ranks of war displayed, and onward still the Scottish lion bore, and still the scattered Southron fled before. Scott eyed the distant height of Sandy Knowe with an enormous gaze as we rode along, and said he had often thought of buying the place, repairing the old tower, and making it his residence. He has in some measure, however, paid off his early debt of gratitude, and clothing it with poetic and romantic associations, by his tale of the Eve of St. John. It is to be hoped that those who actually possess so interesting a monument of Scott's early days will preserve it from further dilapidation. Not far from Sandy Knowe, Scott pointed out another old border hold, standing on the summit of a hill, which had been a kind of enchanted castle to him in his boyhood. It was the Tower of Bemerside, the baronial residence of the Hagues, or de Hagas, one of the oldest families of the border. There had seemed to him, he said, almost a wizard's spell hanging over it, in consequence of a prophecy of Thomas the Rhymer, in which, in his young days, he most potently believed. Betide, betide, whatever betide, Hague shall be Hague of Bemerside. Scott added some particulars which showed that, in the present instance, the venerable Thomas had not proved a false prophet, for it was a noted fact that, amid all the changes and chances of the border, through all the feuds and forays and sackings and burnings, which had reduced most of the castles to ruins, and the proud families that once possessed them to poverty, the Tower of Bemerside still remained unscathed, and was still the stronghold of the ancient family of Hague. Prophecies, however, often ensure their own fulfilment. It is very probable that the prediction of Thomas the Rhymer has linked the Hagues to their tower, as their rock of safety, and has induced them to cling to it almost superstitiously, through hardships and inconveniences that would, otherwise, have caused its abandonment. I afterwards saw at Dryburgh Abbey, the burying place of this predestined and tenacious family, the inscription of which showed the value they set upon their antiquity. Locus sepultura antiquissima familia de Haga de Bemerside. In reverting to the days of his childhood, Scott observed that the lameness which had disabled him in infancy gradually decreased. He soon acquired strength in his limbs, and though he always limped, he became, even in boyhood, a great walker. He used frequently to stroll from home and wander about the country for days together, picking up all kinds of local gossip, and observing popular scenes and characters. His father used to be vexed with him for this wandering propensity, and, shaking his head, would say he fancied the boy would make nothing but a peddler. As he grew older, he became a keen sportsman, and passed much of his time hunting and shooting. His field sports led him into the most wild and unfrequented parts of the country, and in this way he picked up much of that local knowledge which he has since evinced in his writings. His first visit to Loch Katrina, he says, was in his boyish days, on a shooting excursion. The island, which he has made the romantic residence of the Lady of the Lake, was then garrisoned by an old man and his wife. Their house was vacant. They put the key under the door, and were absent fishing. It was at that time a peaceful residence, but became afterward a resort of smugglers, until they were ferreted out. In after years, when Scott began to turn this local knowledge to literary account, he revisited many of those scenes of his early ramblings, and endeavored to secure the fugitive remains of the traditions and songs that had charmed his boyhood. When collecting materials for his Border minstrelsy, he used, he said, to go from cottage to cottage and make the old wives repeat all they knew, if but 2 lines, and by putting these scraps together, he retrieved many a fine characteristic old ballad or tradition from oblivion. I regret to say that I can scarce recollect anything of our visit to Dryburgh Abbey. It is on the estate of the Earl of Buchan. The religious edifice is a mere ruin, rich in Gothic antiquities, but especially interesting to Scott, from containing the family vault and the tombs and monuments of his ancestors. He appeared to feel much chagrin at their being in the possession, and subject to the intermeddlings of the Earl, who was represented as a nobleman of an eccentric character. The latter, however, set great value on these sepulchral relics, and had expressed a lively anticipation of one day or other having the honour of burying Scott, and adding his monument to the collection, which he intended should be worthy of the mighty minstrel of the North, a prospective compliment which was by no means relished by the object of it. One of my pleasant rambles with Scott, about the neighbourhood of Abbotsford, was taken in company with Mr. William Laidlaw, the steward of his estate. This was a gentleman for whom Scott entertained a particular value. He had been born to a competency, had been well educated. His mind was richly stored with varied information, and he was a man of sterling moral worth. Having been reduced by misfortune, Scott had got him to take charge of his estate. He lived at a small farm on the hillside above Abbotsford, and was treated by Scott as a cherished and confidential friend, rather than a dependent. As the day was showery, Scott was attended by one of his retainers, named Tommy Purdie, who carried his plaid and who deserves especial mention. Sophia Scott used to call him her father's grand vizier, and she gave a playful account one evening, as she was hanging on her father's arm, of the consultations which he and Tommy used to have about matters relative to farming. Purdie was tenacious of his opinions, and he and Scott would have long disputes in front of the house, as to something that was to be done on the estate, until the latter, fairly tired out, would abandon the ground and the argument, exclaiming, "Well, well, Tom, have it your own way." After a time, however, Purdie would present himself at the door of the parlour and observe, "I have been thinking over the matter, and upon the whole, I think I'll take your honour's advice." Scott laughed heartily when this anecdote was told of him. It was with him and Tom, he said, as it was with an old laird and a pet servant, whom he had indulged until he was positive beyond all endurance. "This won't do," cried the old laird in a passion. "We can't live together any longer. We must part." "And where the deil does your honour mean to go?" replied the other. I would moreover observe of Tom Purdie, that he was a firm believer in ghosts and warlocks and all kinds of old wives' fable. He was a religious man, too, mingling a little degree of Scottish pride in his devotion, for though his salary was but £20 a year, he had managed to afford £7 for a family Bible. It is true he had £100 clear of the world, and was looked up to by his comrades as a man of property. In the course of our morning walk, we stopped at a small house belonging to one of the labourers on the estate. The object of Scott's visit was to inspect a relic which had been digged up in a Roman camp, and which, if I recollect right, he pronounced to have been a tongs. It was produced by the cottager's wife, a ruddy, healthy-looking dame, whom Scott addressed by the name of Ailie. As he stood regarding the relic, turning it round and round, and making comments upon it, half grave, half comic, with the cottage group around him, all joining occasionally in the colloquy, the inimitable character of Monkbarns was again brought to mind, and I seemed to see before me that prince of antiquarians and humorists holding forth to his unlearned and unbelieving neighbours. Whenever Scott touched in this way upon local antiquities, and in all his familiar conversations about local traditions and superstitions, there was always a sly and quiet humour running at the bottom of his discourse, and playing about his countenance, as if he sported with the subject. It seemed to me as if he distrusted his own enthusiasm, and was disposed to droll upon his own humours and peculiarities. Yet, at the same time, a poetic gleam in his eye would show that he really took a strong relish and interest in them. It was a pity, he said, that antiquarians were generally so dry, for the subjects they handled were rich in historical and poetical recollections, in picturesque details, in quaint and heroic characteristics, and in all kinds of curious and obsolete ceremonials. They are always groping among the rarest materials for poetry, but they have no idea of turning them to poetic use. Now every fragment from old times has, in some degree, its story with it, or gives an inkling of something characteristic of the circumstances and manners of its day, and so sets the imagination at work. For my own part, I never met with antiquarian so delightful, either in his writings or his conversation, and the quiet sub-acid humour that was prone to mingle in his disquisitions gave them to me a peculiar and an exquisite flavour. But he seemed, in fact, to undervalue everything that concerned himself. The play of his genius was so easy that he was unconscious of its mighty power, and made light of those sports of intellect that shamed the efforts and labours of other minds. Our ramble this morning took us again up the Rhymer's Glen, and by Huntley Bank, and Huntley Wood, and the silver waterfall overhung with weeping birches and mountain ashes, those delicate and beautiful trees, which grace the green shaws and burnsides of Scotland. The heather, too, that closely woven robe of Scottish landscape which covers the nakedness of its hills and mountains, tinted the neighbourhood with soft and rich colours. As we ascended the glen, the prospects opened upon us. Melrose, with its towers and pinnacles, lay below. Beyond were the Island Hills, the Cowden Nose, the Tweed, the Gallowater, and all the storied vicinity. The whole landscape varied by gleams of sunshine and driving showers. Scott, as usual, took the lead, limping along with great activity, and in joyous mood, giving scraps of border rhymes and border stories. 2 or 3 times in the course of our walk there were drizzling showers, which I suppose would put an end to our ramble, but my companions trudged on as unconcernedly as if it had been fine weather. At length I asked whether we had not better seek some shelter. "True," said Scott, "I did not recollect that you were not accustomed to our Scottish mists. This is a lachrymose climate, evermore showering. We, however, are children of the mist, and must not mind a little whimpering of the clouds, any more than a man must mind the weeping of an hysterical wife, as you were not accustomed to be wet through as a matter of course in a morning's walk. We will bide a bit under the lee of this bank till the shower is over." Taking his seat under shelter of a thicket, he called to his man George for his tartan. Then turning to me, "Come," said he, "come under my plaidie, as the old song goes." So, making me nestle down beside him, he wrapped a part of the plaid round me, and took me, as he said, under his wing. While we were thus nestled together, he pointed to a hole in the opposite bank of the glen. That, he said, was the hole of an old gray badger, who was doubtless snugly housed in this bad weather. Sometimes he saw him at the entrance of his hole, like a hermit at the door of his cell, telling his beads, or reading a homily. He had a great respect for the venerable anchorite, and would not suffer him to be disturbed. He was a kind of successor to Thomas the Rhymer, and perhaps might be Thomas himself, returned from fairyland, but still under fairy spell. Some accident turned the conversation upon Hogg, the poet, in which Laidlaw, who was seated beside us, took a part. Hogg had once been a shepherd in the service of his father, and Laidlaw gave many interesting anecdotes of him, of which I now retain no recollection. They used to tend the sheep together when Laidlaw was a boy, and Hogg would recite the first struggling conceptions of his muse. At night, when Laidlaw was quartered comfortably in bed, in the farmhouse, poor Hogg would take to the shepherd's hut in the field on the hillside, and there lie awake for hours together, and look at the stars and make poetry, which he would repeat the next day to his companion. Scott spoke in warm terms of Hogg, and repeated passages from his beautiful poem of Kelmeny, to which he gave great and well-merited praise. He gave also some amusing anecdotes of Hogg and his publisher, Blackwood, who was at that time just rising into the bibliographical importance which he has since enjoyed. Hogg, in one of his poems, I believe the Pilgrims of the Sun, had dabbled a little in metaphysics, and, like his heroes, had got into the clouds. Blackwood, who began to affect criticism, argued stoutly with him as to the necessity of omitting or elucidating some obscure passage. Hogg was immovable. "But, man," said Blackwood, "I dinna ken what ye mean in this passage." "Hout tout, man," replied Hogg impatiently, "I dinna ken always what I mean mysel'. There is many a metaphysical poet in the same predicament with honest Hogg." Scott promised to invite the shepherd to Abbotsford during my visit, and I anticipated much gratification in meeting with him, from the account I had received of his character and manners, and the great pleasure I had derived from his works. Circumstances, however, prevented Scott from performing his promise, and to my great regret I left Scotland without seeing one of its most original and national characters. When the weather held up, we continued our walk until we came to a beautiful sheet of water in the bosom of the mountain, called, if I recollect right, the Lake of Caudshiel. Scott prided himself much upon this little Mediterranean sea in his dominions, and hoped I was not too much spoiled by our great lakes in America to relish it. He proposed to take me out to the centre of it, to a fine point of view, for which purpose we embarked in a small boat, which had been put on the lake by his neighbour, Lord Somerville. As I was about to step on board, I observed in large letters on one of the benches, "Search number 2." I paused for a moment and repeated the inscription aloud, trying to recollect something I had heard or read to which it alluded. "Pshaw!" cried Scott, "it is only some of Lord Somerville's nonsense. Get in." In an instant scenes in the antiquary connected with search number 1 flashed upon my mind. "Ah, I remember now," said I, and with a laugh took my seat, but adverted no more to the circumstance. We had a pleasant row about the lake, which commanded some pretty scenery. The most interesting circumstance connected with it, however, according to Scott, was that it was haunted by a bogle in the shape of a water bull, which lived in the deep parts, and now and then came forth upon dry land, and made a tremendous roaring that shook the very hills. This story had been current in the vicinity from time immemorial. There was a man living who declared he had seen the bull, and he was believed by many of his simple neighbors. "I don't choose to contradict the tale," said Scott, "for I am willing to have my lake stocked with any fish, flesh, or fowl that my neighbors think proper to put into it, and these old wives' fables are a kind of property in Scotland that belongs to the estates and goes with the soil. Our streams and lochs are like the rivers and pools in Germany, that have all their Wasser Nix, or water witches, and I have a fancy for these kind of amphibious bogles and hobgoblins." End of chapter 6. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.